Hey, what's up? It's Soup here, and welcome to Kyrian Arcane Mage Fundamentals for 9.2. This is the first of 4 videos I'm releasing that aims to help anyone swapping to Mage or just wanting a refresher coming back to the game for 9.2. This video is going to go over all of the basics that make up the Kyrian Arcane playstyle and the specific adjustments made by 9.2 changes. I want to note that this is not an advanced guide, is not focused on any specific content, and is not going to cover the aspects of Mage that apply to all 3 specs. Instead, this guide is meant to teach you the specific concepts of Kyrian Arcane so that you feel capable of beginning or continuing to develop your gameplay. I will also be making the style guide for Fire and Frost as well as Mage concepts in general, so if you'd like to be notified when I release those, make sure to subscribe. Alright, it's a lot to get into, so let's get started. First thing I want to go over is that Kyrian Arcane is not an uptime spec like Fire or Frost and is different from traditional Arcane. The primary difference is that Kyrian Arcane does not treat mana as a DPS resource the same way as traditional Arcane. The only mana management aspects of Kyrian Arcane are basically just making sure you have enough mana to get through the Radiant Spark ramp and for proccing clear casting. The next concept is Arcane Charges. Arcane Charges are a resource that determines the mana cost and damage of Arcane Blast, how many targets Arcane Barrage hits and how much damage it does, and how much mana is refunded when Arcane Barrage is cast. The way Arcane Charges are generated is with Arcane Orb, Touch of the Magi, Arcane Blast, and Arcane Explosion. Alright, now let's dive into the spellbook and see how arcane spells work. First is Arcane Barrage, and it is the most important spell to understand for Kyrian Arcane. Barrage is primarily modified by how many arcane charges you have. It grants 1.5% mana and cleaves onto 1 additional target per arcane charge up to 5 total targets. The Barrage specific damage modifiers are the Arcane Harmony Legendary, the talent Resonance, and how many charges you have plus Mastery. The Arcane Harmony Legendary causes each tick of arcane missiles to give your next Barrage an 8% damage buff per stack and stacks up to 18 times. You'll see how this legendary affects the playstyle during the rotation commentary. The Resonance talent increases barrage damage by 15% for each target barrage hits. This means that you always get a 15% damage buff for hitting 1 target and up to an extra 60% for 4 additional targets. The Resonant talent makes barrage cleave one of the most important aspects of the Kyrian Arcane playstyle. And then each arcane charge increases the damage that barrage deals by 30% plus mastery. Next, I want to demonstrate some important interactions to understand about barrage. First is barrage travel time. Barrage is not a fast traveling spell, and knowing the travel time at various distances will help you make good positioning decisions to avoid losing damage during the Magi ramp. Next is Barrage snapshotting. Barrage calculates the damage it deals when cast instead of on hit. What this means is that you can cast Barrage with 0.1 seconds left on damage buffs such as Intellect Potion or Rune of Power, and even though Barrage hits the target after those buffs go away, it still benefits from them. And last is how Barrage cleaves. Unfortunately, Barrage cleave isn't very intelligent compared to splitting ice for Frost Mage. The number of cleave targets included with Barrage is determined when cast due to snapshotting, so it's important to be aware of when Barrage will and won't cleave. I've found that the size of the hitbox and enemy movement can impact Barrage's ability to cleave. My best guess is because Barrage travels to the center of enemy hitboxes, so cleave range is determined from that point. Knowing how Barrage functions will help you make better decisions about Barrage prep and timing to maximize the damage modifiers available. Moving on to Arcane Blast. Blast is the single target arcane charge generator. The cast time, damage dealt, and mana cost of Blast changes with the number of charges. Knowing how charges affect Blast will help rotational decisions about generating charges based on factors such as distance from targets, number of targets, and time until the next Magi ramp. For example, Arcane Explosion deals more damage to 1 target than a 0 charge Arcane Blast, and Arcane Explosion deals more damage to 2 targets than a 2 charge Arcane Blast. These are finer nuances of the build, but understanding how to dynamically generate charges to build barrages will help with the overall execution of the playstyle. Next spell to cover is Arcane Missiles, but before getting into that, it's important to understand how clear casting and slipstream work. Clear casting is a passive part of Arcane and causes every 250 mana spent to have a 1% chance to give you a free Arcane Explosion or empowered Arcane Missiles cast. Clear casting causes missiles to fire 1 additional bolt plus 2 extra from the amplification talent. This means that clear casting missiles will cast a total of 8 bolts, which is an important number to remember. Slipstream is a talent on the Shimmer row and is my preferred choice when playing Arcane because it allows you to move freely while channeling clear casting missiles or evocate. Both Shimmer and Slipstream are equally viable ways to play Arcane, but I preferred Slipstream in all content for 9.1. The main reason I prefer Slipstream is because clear casting missiles also cause arcane power to cool down faster with the Arcane Prodigy Conduit, so protecting that cooldown reduction from movement is very helpful. Another thing to know about missiles is that it's a channel, not a cast, meaning that the 7,500 mana cost is spent up front and the damage is dealt periodically. This is important for two reasons. It means that missiles makes a great filler when trying to spend mana to fish for clear casting procs, and that even if the channel is interrupted by movement, you have still dealt some damage and built barrage stacks. This is why I believe Arcane Missiles makes a better filler in general than Arcane Blast. Alright, on to Arcane Orb, which is technically a talent, but it's an auto pick and should probably just be a baseline spell. Arcane Orb generates 1 arcane charge when cast and then 1 each time it deals damage. The important aspects of Orb to be aware of are that it travels 40 yards and should be aimed carefully, and that on 3+ targets, it will generate 4 arcane charges, giving you a quick barrage. Next up is Arcane Power. This is Arcane's major DPS cooldown that increases damage and reduces mana costs by 30%. The talent Overpowered increases this to 50%, making Arcane Power a large part of burst damage. Arcane Power should be lined up with Radiant Spark and Touch of the Magi as Kyrian Arcane. Moving to Mana Gem. Mana Gems are a conjured item that refunds 10% of your mana with a 2-minute cooldown. Your use of Mana Gems will depend on how much mastery you have for the most part, but you want to make sure you have Mana Gems ready when you pull a boss. On to Evocate. This spell increases your mana regen while you channel for 6 seconds and will refill your mana bar. As Kyrian Arcane, there's no reason to channel Evocate for longer than it takes to get full mana. I like to use Evocate during movement when I'm low on mana because I take this Slipstream talent. This next spell is my absolute favorite part of the Arcane toolkit and something I miss quite a bit when playing the other specs. Greater Invisibility. The reason I love this spell so much is because it works as a feign death because you get Invis immediately. It gives you a 60% damage reduction buff while invised and for 3 seconds after it breaks, and only has a 2-minute cooldown. Greater Invis is an incredibly powerful and versatile defensive ability that should be a frequently used part of the toolkit. Moving on to Presence of Mind. This spell causes your next 3 arcane blasts to be instant cast and should be used creatively as Kyrian Arcane. For example, Presence of Mind can be used to speed up generating arcane charges at range, allow you to move freely during a single target Magi ramp, or used as movement filler in general. The main way I use it is to protect the Magi ramp from forced movement. Next up is Prismatic Barrier. This is another part of the Arcane toolkit that I miss. This barrier provides a 20% magic damage reduction and reduces the duration of magic effects by 35%. What's so cool about Prismatic Barrier is that even if the magic damage you take is more than the Absorb Shield, it will still reduce the entire hit by 20%. Holding Prismatic Barrier for specific mechanics like large magic dots or large single magic hits can have a lot of value, so be on the lookout for that. Alright, on to Rune of Power. This is another talent that is an auto pick and it lets you drop a ground effect that increases your damage by 40% for 12 seconds on a 45-second cooldown. This talent also causes Arcane Power to passively drop a rune. Planning when to use cooldowns to make sure you can stand inside the 8-yard radius of Rune is a very important part of the playstyle. Rune is mostly used with Magi, although it can have some flexible usage, but more on that later. And on to Slow. This is a single target spell that reduces movement speed by 60% for 15 seconds. I highly recommend using a mouse over macro for this spell because it makes it much easier to quickly apply Slow to Kite. The next spell is Touch of the Magi. Magi is a very large part of the ramp playstyle of Kyrian Arcane. This is because Magi doesn't deal any damage itself. Instead, it stores a percentage of the damage you deal to your Magi target and then pops for that damage plus reduced AOE when the debuff expires. The main aspect of Magi to understand is that you want to fit as much damage in that window as you can, which means being aware of the travel time of Barrage. Because of this, it's almost always a good idea to play as close to melee as possible to get as much time to build barrages during Magi as you can. Planning ahead for when you use Magi to try and include as much cleave as possible is how you unlock the insane burst potential of this build, so long as you don't sacrifice effective cooldown uses to do so. Next, I want to go over Arcane Mastery. Mastery does a few things. It increases your mana regen and maximum mana, increases blast and barrage damage per arcane charge, and also provides a flat increase to arcane damage. Given how many peripheral damage buffs are a part of this playstyle, it seems like Mastery is mainly to mitigate mana issues. I'll get into stats in more detail later in this video. Alright, enough of the Arcane Spellbook, let's move on to Kyrian Arcane Covenant abilities. The last major piece of the DPS puzzle for Kyrian Arcane is Radiant Spark. Radiant Spark applies a dot that also causes your next 5 spells to gain a ramping damage buff starting at 0%. It sounds a little strange, but I'll show you. You can see here that each Arcane Blast is adding 1 Radiant Spark stack. An interesting aspect of Radiant Spark is that each stack benefits from Ire of the Ascended, meaning that the 4th Spark stack currently gives an 80% damage buff with max level Renown and Conduits. Also, the Kyrian Covenant legendary that will be used in 9.2 is called Harmonic Echo and works off of Radiant Spark. It makes the Radiant Spark damage buff proc an additional 25% damage to your target and up to 4 additional targets. This is a huge part of why the Kyrian Arcane AOE damage profile is going to be very strong up to 5 targets and 9.2. The signature Covenant ability gives you access to Phial of Serenity. This is an extra potion that clears all debuff types except magic and is off the global. Look for places to use this because it's actually a pretty strong piece of kit to have. You only get one use in combat, similar to Hellstones though, so be purposeful about it. Moving on to talents. Kyrian Arcane doesn't have too much flexibility when it comes to talent choices. The talents you see here are what you'll take in almost all content. I did recently find out that the talent Arcane Echo sims higher than Resonance for single target only from the video that Toe Grinder recently released. I left a link to that in the description, so make sure to check that out and show your support. I do think that Fire will be a better pure single target spec than Arcane due to Barrage crit RNG, but it is cool that there's a better single target option. The main choices you have are between Shimmer and Slipstream as previously mentioned, and between Ring of Frost and Chrono Shift. Chrono Shift causes Barrage to apply a 50% slow to your target and give you a 50% move speed for 5 seconds. This is a useful talent in Raid, but in Mythic Plus, I usually take Ring of Frost because Arcane lacks group utility. Alright, next up is Soulbinds and Conduits. Starting with Conduits, there are 3 potency conduits that Kyrian Arcane uses. Ire of the Ascended increases the damage buff from each Radiant Spark stack, Magi's Brand increases how much damage you contribute to Touch of the Magi, and Arcane Prodigy causes each bolt of clear casting missiles to decrease the cooldown of arcane power. For Endurance Conduits, the 2 highest HBS options are Condensed Animosphere and Tempest Barrier. Finesse Conduits can change based on personal preference, but as Kyrian Arcane, I like to use Flow of Time because I take Slipstream. Moving on to Soulbinds, starting with Pelagos. Pelagos runs triple potency, and the most important Soulbind traits to be aware of are Combat Meditation and Newfound Resolve. I suggest using a weak aura to track both of these, and you can find those in my Discord. Next is Clea. Clea isn't very commonly used, but I have been a big fan throughout 9.1. The reason Clea is a really strong option is because the crit you get from Pointed Courage, Spear of the Archon, and Light the Path bypasses the secondary stat diminishing returns. The drawback to using Clea is that you only get 2 potency conduits, which puts arcane power on a static 2-minute cooldown. I think Clea has some potential in 9.2 Mythic Plus due to the cooldown reduction buffs from the encrypted affix. And last is Mechanicos. Mechanicos runs triple potency, and the main Soulbind traits you should be aware of are Bronze Call to Action and Effusive Anima Accelerator. I've never been a big fan of Mechanicos because when Bronze spawns, he knocks back enemies, and it's common for that to blow trash packs apart. This can cause Barrage to fail to cleave, which could be a 60% damage loss. Effusive Anima Accelerator causes Radiant Spark to proc AOE Arcane damage and reduce its cooldown by 2 seconds for each target hit up to 10 seconds. This has potentially strong synergy with the Covenant legendary Harmonic Echo. Overall, the way I approach choosing a Soulbind is based on the encounter. If I'm able to effectively use arcane power on cooldown every minute and a half, then either Mechanicos or Pelagos are going to be a better option than Clea. But if there's forced downtime or ad spawn timers that cause arcane power to be better utilized on a 2-minute timer, then Clea is worth considering. A great example of this was on Fate Scribe in 9.1. I used Magi on pull and held arcane power for when the first tank ad died so I can include 4 cleave targets in my boss funnel. Combat Meditation cooldown timing is another factor to consider. If the way you use Radiant Spark prevents Combat Meditation from lining up with arcane power, then Pelagos may not be the best play. Before we move on to stats, I want to thank you for making it this far in the video, and I have a request. This video is following a slightly different format with how I present the information, and I would love to hear what you think. Hit the like button or let me know in the comments. Alright, time for stats. I'm not sure if stats are going to change much for 9.2, but instead of trying to give you a specific target, I want to explain how I approach gearing secondary stats for Kyrian Arcane. Crit sims well in AoE and is a part of the foundation of this build because Barrage crits are what lead to the big damage potential. With that said, crit is also a gambling stat. I say this because even if you stacked 99% crit, if Barrage doesn't crit during arcane power, then gearing that heavily for crit was a waste. I found that the sims had me stay around 20 to 24% crit throughout 9.1. Next is haste. Haste has a big impact on how Kyrian Arcane feels. On paper, the suggested haste has been around 10%, but I've preferred playing with 12 to 14% haste because of how rigid the Magi ramp is. There is a change to the 9.2 rotation that I'll get into later that may make playing with lower haste more manageable, but I've found that even the global cooldown feels sluggish at or below 10%. In general, I suggest finding a haste level you find playable between 8 and 14% and then focus on maintaining that level while adjusting your other stats. On to versatility. Verse is a great defensive stat, and during 9.1, as my item level increased, my sims were telling me to start stacking verse over crit and mastery. And last is mastery. I went over how mastery works earlier, but throughout 9.1, I found that 28 to 32% was a good level to be around to avoid mana issues, and sims have always told me to lose mastery if I went above this range. Before getting into the rotation, I want to go over over the 9.2 tier set for Arcane. The 2-piece causes you to deal 10% more arcane damage to targets with Magi on them, and the 4-piece causes Magi to last 12 seconds. A 12-second Magi is going to add 4 seconds of ramp time, but it also means Magi lasts the same duration as Rune. We also get to pump even more damage into Magi, which is awesome for the arcane power ramp. Anyways, it's finally time for some practical application. Let's get into the rotation, starting with single target. Starting before the pull, it's important to fish for a clear casting proc using Arcane Explosion, because 1 clear casting missiles plus 2 regular missiles equals the 18 stacks needed to begin the first Magi ramp. Sometimes you won't get a clear casting proc, but it is important to try. I precast Rune at 2 seconds on the pull timer and begin building to 18 Barrage stacks. I use Ruby before I start the ramp due to the travel time, and then cast Radiant Spark, Magi, Arcane Power, then 4 Arcane Blasts, and Barrage. At this point, I want to highlight the change to the Magi ramp from 9.1. The 5th Arcane Blast snapshot is no longer part of the rotation because the 25% damage proc from Harmonic Echo won't work for both the Barrage and the 5th Blast. This causes Echo to proc off the Blast because it hits before the Barrage, which is a huge DPS loss. After I send Barrage, I cast Orb and then build as many Barrage stacks as I can and send a second Barrage. My goal is to hold casting Barrage as long as I can to build stacks while making sure Barrage still hits during Magi. After that Barrage goes out, I cast missiles until the end of Arcane Power and then focus on building as many big Barrages as I can until 12 seconds before Magi. The reason 12 seconds before Magi is important is because it takes roughly 9 seconds to build 18 Barrage stacks without any clear casting procs. This leaves 3 seconds to cast Rune and Spark, then Magi the same global it's ready. I send whatever Barrage I have at 12 seconds and then begin prepping for Magi. I've changed up the mini ramp opener from 9.1 because of the longer duration of Magi and Harmonic Echo. The 5th Blast dropping from the rotation frees up a global, and Magi's longer duration from the tier set means that you can get more value from Rune by casting Radiant Spark first. I cast Radiant Spark, Rune, Magi, and then do the same 4 Blast into Barrage ramp. After that, I follow the same rotation of building as many big Barrages as I can until Arcane Power and Magi come back up. You can wait until 10 seconds to prep Barrage stacks for an Arcane Power ramp because you don't have to cast Rune before Magi. Next is the AOE rotation. The most common AOE you'll encounter will be in Mythic Plus, and aside from the first pull of the key, you should always aim to have 18 Barrage stacks going into every pull. I use the same opener as single target, but then cast Arcane Explosion, Arcane Blast, Barrage, Orb, Barrage, and then build as big a Barrage as I can until right before Magi ends. The reason for this rotation is because Harmonic Echo doesn't proc from the first direct damage spell after Spark. After the Magi ramp, I follow the AOE rotation on 3+ targets of building arcane charges with Arcane Explosion and only casting missiles with clear casting procs. At 8+ targets, you can ignore missiles altogether. Due to Harmonic Echo, I think the AOE Magi ramp you saw here is now the play on 3+ targets. You can find the math behind why I think this is the case in the description. The next Magi use has the same mini ramp opener as single target as well. The last thing I want to say about the rotation is that I suggest looking for opportunities to squeeze extra uses of cooldowns whenever possible. What I mean by this is using Rune or Spark either paired together or by themselves when they would otherwise be wasted can be a DPS increase. Almost every arcane cooldown is a percentage damage amplifier, so getting more total uses of them without sacrificing the important Magi uses is where I think this build does really well. Thank you so much for making it this far. If you found this video helpful, then pass it along to a mage in need, and remember, never stop improving. Peace!